So at the time of the Russian conquest of Central Asia, if we date that from, I suppose, around the middle of the 18th century, you have three khanates, as they're conventionally known, in the southern part of Central Asia. That is Khiva and Kokand and Bukhara. And then you have a series of sort of loosely overlapping political authorities in the Kazakh steppe, generally known as the zhuzes or hordes. So the Great Horde, the Middle Horde, and the Junior Horde. And these are characterized by fairly fluid borders, by, in some cases, various hierarchies of political authority. So they're not centralized states with hard borders of the kind that I suppose the Russians are used to dealing with on their European frontier. Beginning of the 19th century, the Russian frontier still runs along the northern fringes of the steppe. It runs along the lines of fortresses which they'd established around Orenburg, the West Siberian line, in the early 18th century. It hasn't really moved since that point. And the Russians don't exercise any control or sovereignty, really, over the Kazakhs even at that stage. So how do they get from what are basically the modern borders of the Russian Federation today, it's more or less the same place, all the way to Tashkent, which is to the south of Kazakhstan? Well, there's a series of stages to this process. In the 1820s, the Russians try to exert a more direct administration over the Kazakhs of the middle and the junior hordes. They create an administrative system, they try to regulate their movement, they try to collect taxes from them, to administer justice. Not very effectively, but still, this is the first time they've really sought to extend their sovereignty in a more concrete way over the steppe regions. Then in the 1830s, they start to mount more prolonged or aggressive military expeditions. The most important one of these is the expedition they launched against the Khanate of Khiva in 1839. So this involved 5,000 men, about 10,000 camels, set out from Orenburg in the winter of 1839, and it failed. It failed because all of the camels died, basically. But then the Russians felt that they had to do something to restore the prestige that they'd lost as a result of that. That drew them into building fortifications still more deeply into the steppe. Some of these were also designed to combat the rebellion, as the Russians saw it, of the Sultan of the Middle Horde, Kenesari, the son of Qasim, who was a Chinggisid, who claimed the right to be Khan over the Middle Horde, which was a title that the Russians had abolished. He mounted a number of raids on Russian settlements, on Kazakhs under Russian sovereignty. So they also mounted repeated campaigns in the steppe and new fortifications to combat him. And although Kenesari died in 1847, the Russian advance into the steppe continued. But you could make a case for 1822. You could even make a case and go back all the way to 1732, when Abulkhair Khan of the Kazakh Junior Horde supposedly at least first acknowledged Russian sovereignty. So it's not a completely straightforward thing to answer. I guess we're looking at quite a complex example of imperial expansion. And there are three traditional explanations for this that you'll find in most of the historiography. The one that's best known to English-speaking readers is that of the Great Game. So the idea is that the Russians are advancing in Central Asia, conquering territory there because their real object is British India. They want to threaten the security of the British in India, and they want to use that for diplomatic leverage. What you'll find in most Soviet-era historiography is an economic explanation. So there, the idea is that it's all about the search for captive markets, particularly for Russia's burgeoning textile industry at the time, and for a secure source of raw cotton. So in this explanation, the prime movers are the Moscow textile manufacturers, the krupnaya bourgeoisie, as they call them in Russian, in Soviet historiography, who are supposedly pulling strings behind the scenes to persuade the imperial state to annex this region on their behalf. And then the final explanation you find is basically that the whole thing happens by accident. So what motivates it is local initiative, the man on the spot So whether that's the governor of Orenburg, or whether it's General Chernyayev attacking Tashkent in 1865, supposedly without authorization, and that St. Petersburg is not really in control of the process at all. Now, I have a problem with all three of those explanations. I don't think any of them really explain it properly. And I don't necessarily have a single overarching explanation to replace these. I'm not sure that grand theories are very helpful. I think we need to understand each phase of the advance on its own terms. But if I had to hit on one, I would say what matters is prestige. The Russians do not want to seem weak. They do not want to seem foolish. They do not want to abandon territory that they've already taken. And they are constantly worrying about their image. They're worried that they will seem weak in the eyes of Central Asian peoples. They're worried that they will seem weak in the eyes of their European great power rivals, Britain and France. That, if you're going to look for a single factor that influences their thinking that comes up over and over again, then that's the one. So it's hard, you can't really say that the Kazakhs played a single unified role in the conquest. Different groups of Kazakhs played different roles at different times. So if we look at the junior Zhuz and the middle Zhuz, they have a long-standing political relationship with Russia that goes back to the early 18th century. Some groups of elites within these two Zhuzes, so these are the Chinggisid elites that hold political authority amongst them, cooperate with Russia. They accept Russian titles and uniforms. They accept posts in the administration that the Russians start to create from the 1820s and 1830s onwards. They cooperate, for instance, in rounding up the camels that the Russians need for their campaigns. And Kazakhs from these groups will serve the Russians as drivers and also as spies. So they make extensive use of Kazakh spies and scouts in Central Asia. But other groups, in many cases from the same hordes, from the same tribes, are resisting Russia at the same time. So this is obviously true of Kenesari, whom I've already mentioned, who leads a revolt within the Orta Zhuz, the Middle Zhuz, against the Russians. It's true of other groups as well. In the southern part of the steppe, amongst the Kazakhs of the Great Horde, many of them are serving the Kokand Khanate, and in that capacity they fight against Russian forces when they invade. So we have Kazakhs really on different shades of the political spectrum, if you like. Those who serve Kokand or other Central Asian states, those who serve Russia, those who are fighting on their own behalf in order to try to maintain a steppe confederation of some description, a degree of independence. And they play a very, very important role in the logistics of the Russian conquest. So without the Kazakhs supplying the transport, the camels, the guides, the scouts, the Russians would never have been able to conquer Central Asia in the first place. In terms of its use of Russian archival sources, I think my work will be the most comprehensive treatment out there. In terms of its use of Central Asian sources, less so. My linguistic abilities are not such that they would allow me to give a really full perspective on the conquest from the Kazakh or from the Kievan or Kokandi point of view, though I'm trying to introduce an element of that there. I think that, above all, I'm treating this as an episode that's important in its own right. So this is something that's important because it was important for Central Asia. Central Asia's history was fundamentally transformed by being conquered by Russia, for better or worse. That relationship exists to this day. It's a relationship which has its positive and negative sides, but certainly was founded, at least to begin with, on cultural and political inequality and subordination. I'm not treating it as just a sideshow in a great game conflict between two great powers, or as a minor part of the history of Russia itself. And as I've said, I have a different interpretation as to why it happened. I think that it grows in many ways out of the Russian perception, in a sense, of Russian insecurities in some ways, their sense of their own weakness, their sense that they needed to struggle to maintain their place at the top table of great powers. That in the end, if you try to understand this as a rational process, something that is an outcome of a rational calculations of strategic or economic advantage, you're going to misunderstand it. That the roots of it are much less rational and much more emotional in many ways.